It feels like Anish Giri is a new man right now. He's playing really attacking, ferocious, aggressive chess, and you can see it in his style and results over the last 6 to 12 months. And this game that he played against Nikita Vichigov is a great example of this style. He played it yesterday in Belgrade as part of this FIDE Grand Prix event, and this is the second leg of 3 events which are trying to decide who will take the final 2 spots for the candidates in June. So Giri had white here, Vichigov had black. Let's see what happened, and if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button, never miss one. So okay, Giri kicked off with pawn to e4 here, and we went in for this Italian game characterised by bishop to c4. And Giri actually recently did a lecture on the Italian game with Chess Base India. I'll link that video down below if you want to check it out afterwards. It was really instructive. So okay, we had these standard opening moves with the bishop coming to c5. It can sit on e7 there, but okay, it comes outside the pawn chain in this game. And after these moves here, we had pawn c3 from Giri. So he's preparing to go d4 at a later point. Sometimes this bishop now has a retreat route as well. We had pawn h6 now from black, rook e1, castles, and now this knight came to d2. And oftentimes this knight is re-maneuvering round to the king side like this. So we had pawn to a5 now, gains some queenside space and also gives this bishop some retreat room. Pawn h3 covered the g4 square, and now bishop e6 challenges this strong light squared bishop, which is looking at the black king. Now you can take here, but after the pawn recaptures, it doesn't lead to too much for white. You've opened up this f-file, this one covers some key squares, and it helps support d5 at a later point. So instead, what you see more commonly from white here is bishop to b5, moving the bishop away, keeping pieces on the board, keeping tension. But instead, Giri played pawn to b3 here. A really interesting idea, because if captures, the b pawn will take back, and now you get some good dynamic play down the b file. You also clamp on the d5 break, and we note that this d4 square is still taken away from the knight by this pawn. So this is a nice pawn structure for white. So black didn't take, instead pushed pawn to d5, a standard idea to break in the centre. Now the pawn recaptured and the knight jumped in. So when you play d5, you gain space, you give your knight a square in the centre, which is great, but you do weaken the e5 pawn, and this is the cat and mouse battle now. So you can't take that pawn immediately, I should say. If you do, then you're hanging this one on c3. That's the thing about this b3 move. And equally, if you try to take this knight first as white, this is no good. The bishop can recapture, and now if you take here, you could have a line like this, and the problem is this f2 point. So the bishop takes with check. This is the issue. Queen comes out, check. The knight can block, but you can chop it with the bishop. After the queen recaptures, you're dropping that rook. So I know that's a long line there, but you just have to be very careful about trying to win that e-pawn as the white player. So that's why Giri didn't jump in and take that pawn in this position. Instead, he played knight to e4 here. So he centralises his knight, covers the c3 pawn now, and also attacks this bishop. So the bishop dropped back, and now there is a threat to go pawn to f5, kick the knight, and then jump in here. And once again, you don't want to start giving up this bishop for knight. That's better for black. So here the move queen d2 was played. A really nice idea to cover the pawn, because you don't want to go with the bishop, say, to b2. You'd rather that bishop comes to a3 and pressure down here. And now black has to find a plan. And best here, I think, was rook to e8. It's quite deep stuff, but keeping that rook on the e-file here, defending this pawn, also the bishop in case you ever have to play f6, is a good idea here. And you keep the queen in the centre, protecting the knight. Now I'll show the relevance of all this in a moment, because Vichigov played queen to c8. This is a standard idea, but slightly the wrong move order. So he pressures down here, the knight dropped back to g3 now, and it opens up the attack on this pawn by these 2 pieces. And now that pawn genuinely is on prise. So that's why pawn f6 was played. But here's the problem now with not having the rook on e8, not having the queen on d8. the move d4 comes, and because the white heavy pieces are in the centre, this is good for white. You don't want to take here. It's quite deep stuff, but there's a move queen d3. You just nudge up the board, and black can't actually take this pawn with the knight. You lose your bishop. You can't take here, or you're losing your knight. You can even take the rook first. The whole thing's just falling apart. And if you try something like bishop f7 or queen d7 here, well, the problem is there's these thematic sacrifices on h6 with the bishop. The queen's coming into g6. You've got knights coming into the game like this. The whole thing is just falling apart for black. So this is the problem. When Giri played this move, pawn to d4, black can't meet it with capturing, and therefore had to go queen to d7 here. So your queen's just gone c8, d7, lost a lot of time. So a nice initiative now for Giri, and he follows up with bishop to a3, hits this rook, and again you can't put it on its most natural square, because then simply white captures here. After pawn recaptures, you're winning this pawn, it's a clean pawn. But what black does instead is go rook f7 here after it's attacked, and this is slightly different. Now if you try and win the pawn, we have a line like this, and you can't take back with the rook because f2 is sensitive and about to drop. These two pieces are on it. So instead of capturing that pawn, here Giri played rook to e4. He could have also brought this rook to the centre, but he's preparing to double on the e-file now. So a4 was played here now by black, trying to get some queenside counterplay. Once again, you don't want to start taking in the centre, ripping open lines for the rook. And now Giri keeps the position closed. He plays pawn to b4 here. You don't want to activate this rook, especially when this one's coming here. And although you shut in your bishop, he's got ideas to go b5 later and then liberate that piece again. So the knight now came to f4. These bishops were exchanged here, and Giri doubled his rooks on the e-file. Still lots of pressure, but black does get in this knight g5 move. He's hitting both of these pieces, and he forces this exchange here. At least he's got one of those attacking knights off the board. But by recapturing like this, now the h-file is open, and that could be an attacking possibility later on. So pawn b5 was now played. It opens this bishop, but after knight a7, we can see that pawn is critically weak. If you go pawn c4, you're simply losing this one. That's much better for black. So Giri didn't defend the pawn. What do you think his big idea was in this position to carry on the attack? If you want to pause and look for it, please do so. So he played pawn to h4 here, a really nice attacking idea. Black took on b5, hitting the unprotected bishop. And now what's the follow-up here? Again, can you see the move? So here, Giri simply took that pawn on g5, leaving a whole bishop to be taken. Now black didn't take that bishop, but here's the trap that you set. Pawn to g6. Now you're hitting that rook, say it moves away to e7, then you can either go queen e2 or queen d1. The point is you're coming onto these light squares and you're coming down here. And it's just a devastating attack. These pieces just aren't in the defense, and this pawn's pretty much as good as a bishop in this position. Vichigov saw this. He didn't take the bishop on a3 and allow this. Instead, he took the pawn on g5. And now Giri understands the importance of the initiative. So he left his bishop once again and captured here. The knight took the bishop, so Giri's a whole piece down. What's the follow-up here? Well, he plays rook to h4. You have to bring a piece to the h-file, start threatening those checkmating attacks. So now we had the rook coming to e8, covering this e-pawn some more. The queen slid over here, threatening mate in 1, and that's why the rook came to f6, giving some room. Now the knight jumped in, hit e4, hits that rook, and you can't come to h6 with the rook, or there's a simple tactic here. We capture that one. Once you retake, we check and win the queen. This is better for white. So we didn't have rook h6 played. Instead, the rook now came to f5. But after the knight came to g5, there's just way too many problems here against the king. So here the rook had to give itself up. The queen recaptured, and now black makes a fatal error. So the best move in the position here is knight c4. bring that one back into the position, cover this e5 pawn some more, and then if you go queen to g6, now you have rook e6 as a defensive resource. If you check and go king f8, well, the difference here is that this pawn is now covered by the knight, so you can't start taking here, for example, with the rook. We'd simply pick that one up. The difference in the game is that after queen takes on g5, pawn c5 was played. So you can see that black's trying to open the bishop, but now queen g6 comes, and this is more deadly, because if rook e6 comes now, the difference is this pawn's not covered by this knight. So you could check like this, and after the king moves away, the rook crashes through. This is the problem. If rook takes, then we can actually throw in some checks here first, like this. The king sidesteps, we take on g7, and then pick up this rook. And the rook is just completely better than the two minor pieces in this position, plus you've got these two connected passed pawns. Black's completely lost. So instead, after queen g6, we had bishop back to d8. That piece was attacked. The rook is hit, and now can you see the best move in the position that finished the game? Here black actually resigned. So Giri played rook to h7, and he's just setting up a really nice attacking idea of dropping the queen back here and then delivering mate with the rook here. And the importance of this setup is that the queen then covers this critical diagonal. And it's just really hard for black to do anything about this. Say you bring your bishop across the cover, well, now we play queen h5 anyway. The king could come to f8 trying to run here, but now we have pawn takes supported by queen and rook, and the whole thing's just collapsing for black. If you enjoyed this game, then click here to see another amazing epic chess game. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.